this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to part 2 of my discussion with John Miles, founder and chief executive officer of PassionStruck. We pick up our conversation talking about the importance of originality mixed with adaptability and the tremendous growth seen in companies like Microsoft and Amazon, as highlighted in his book, PassionStruck.
All the behavior shifts really are oriented to help people in both work and life situations. One of the ones that I think is most beneficial is something that I call the Originality Embracer. And I named it this because oftentimes in work, we end up just following the crowd. We see what other people are doing, what other companies are doing, and we try to replicate their success. And this chapter is really about the importance of originality mixed with adaptability and how the fusion of those two things, if you're willing to take the risks to do so, can result in so much tremendous growth. And I think a great example of this that we're seeing right now play out is Microsoft. In this chapter, I really focus the chapter on Jeff Bezos and Amazon, but I think what Microsoft has done over the past 10 years, particularly the leadership of Satya Nadella, is really a great example of originality embracer in work. I remember coming out of Dell, where I was a CIO for them. I had met Steve Ballmer multiple times, and Steve had requested that I interview to become the CIO of Microsoft. And I remember going on these arduous interviews, and at the time Steve was there, he really led by intimidation. And so you had this company that really had a fixed mindset. They were really at that time not a place that the brightest minds coming out of Silicon Valley universities wanted to work at. And what you saw was year after year of decline in the company because people were really just becoming followers. There wasn't really a learning environment at that time, etc. And I remember when I was doing these interviews, I was hearing so much negativity about the environment until I had an interview with a gentleman who had been at the company for a long time, and he was singing a completely different tune. And that interview was with Satya Nadella, and he was talking about the greatness that Microsoft could become. And I thought about taking the position. I didn't take it because I thought about what the work environment would be like. And that was in 2011. Satya came to become the CEO just 2 or 3 years later. And I sometimes think about what life could have been like if I had taken that chance. But what he really brought into Microsoft was Carol Dweck's growth mindset. Now, he calls it a learning mindset, but he really fostered an environment of constant learning, of experimenting, of embracing original ideas and adapting to the times around us. And that's what this chapter is really about. It's the fact that if we keep doing the things the way that they've always been done, things are never going to be different. And I think when people think of Amazon, they think of the way that Jeff Bezos started the company, which was mimicking Books A Million or Border Books or Barnes & Noble. But what they fail to see is what his original idea was to be the store for everything, the everything store. But he knew that if he wanted to build that, he needed to enter the market in a place that time people were accustomed to shopping. So books was a great entry point to get a foothold. But his original idea was then to take it far beyond that and to adapt and to constantly adapt as he started to build out the different verticals within the company and to really use this original idea of 2-day delivery as a way that he could transform the way that consumers shopped, and he could better leverage his supply chain and his delivery model going against companies like Target, Home Depot, Walmart, etc. And so that's what that chapter is all about. And it kind of teaches you how to do that both in an individual way and in a way that if you're a company or an entrepreneur that you could use in your business life.
Well, I wouldn't regret it too much, hopefully. I think you've done okay, even though you didn't take the position. It reminded me of a story. So I started off right out of high school. I joined the Navy and spent 6 years as an enlisted guy. And I'll talk about a failure real quick. And at the time, it was just absolutely devastating. Just could not think of a worse thing to have happened to me. And it ended up being the best thing that ever happened to me was I attended Naval Nuclear Power School as an enlisted guy. This was back when it was in Orlando, Florida. And it's a 6-month program for those who don't know. And you have to take all these tests along the way. And the way it works is you can never fail more than 3 tests. I never failed a single one. And then the last day you take a comprehensive exam. You have to score 250 out of 400 points. And I scored 232. So I just missed it. And they said, oh, we're going to send you to the fleet. And so I asked to see the captain, and I said, can I do extra credit? Can I do anything? And the basic answer was no. And I remember walking away from that session going, I've ruined the rest of my life because I didn't pass this one test. And had I passed that test, I would have continued on. I probably would have got out of the Navy and gone to work in a nuclear power plant. I would not have pursued being an electrical engineer, which is what I was able to go off and pursue. I would never have written multiple books. I would not be talking to John Miles right now on the Conversation podcast. So it's one of those things that at the time was just completely devastating. I'll never forget. Those who are in the service don't know, but you're supposed to, when you're outside, put on your cover, your hat. And I just was in such a daze walking away. I didn't have my cover on. I wasn't saluting anybody. I mean, I was literally just out to lunch at that moment and thinking my life was over at 18. And nothing could have been further from the truth. So hopefully your life hasn't been too impacted because you didn't take that job.
Yeah, another great nuclear power story, and I don't think people realize how tough those schools are and how they pick the cream of the crop to go into them. But I remember hearing horror stories when I was at the Naval Academy from previous generations who had been interviewed by Admiral Hyman Rickover. And I recently did a solo episode of my podcast about Jimmy Carter. And there's a story about Jimmy Carter, our former president, that a lot of people don't know. He graduated from the Naval Academy, went into the Surface Navy, and then applied to go into the Nuclear Navy. And he was interviewed by Hyman Rickover. He goes into this 2.5-hour interview. The Admiral says, pick whatever topics you want to talk about. And so Carter picks topics that he's familiar with, whether it's Stoic philosophy or ancient Eastern medicine type of things, whatever he wanted to talk about. And pretty soon he realizes that his mastery of these topics is nothing like the Admiral's. The Admiral is so well read in everything. He realized he's met his master. And at the end of this interview, he says to Carter, did you always do your best when you were at the Naval Academy? And Carter thinks about it and gives him an honest answer. No, I didn't always do my best. And then the Admiral says, why not? And that simple conversation and realizing that he hadn't always done his best, whether it was studying at that time Soviet aircraft or military doctrine, navigational excellence, whatever it might be, he realized that he could either choose to live his life like that, or he could intentionally choose that he wasn't going to do that in the future. And it completely transformed Jimmy Carter's whole approach to life and what led him to where he is today. But he looked at that interview with the Admiral, even though he was accepted in the Nuclear Navy, as a failure point because he realized that he had not always been trying to do his best.
Yeah, I didn't have to interview, obviously, as an enlisted guy, but a lot of the instructors in nuclear power school did interview with him, and I would hear all those stories. And quick aside, where did Jimmy Carter go before he went to the Naval Academy? He went to my alma mater, which is Georgia Tech. So we both get to claiming.
Yeah, I heard it. As I was writing this episode out, there was an amazing story of Jimmy Carter that I never knew about. There was a partial meltdown of a reactor in Canada, and he was single-handedly selected by Rickover to go and fix the situation, and it basically meant that when they approached it, they could only be lowered into this nuclear reactor cavity for 90 seconds, or they would have radiation poisoning. And he actually cleaned up the whole mess, and it was something that I never knew about him. But if you look at how he approached it and how intentional he was about how they practiced on tennis courts, how they kept going through repetition after repetition to make sure that it was a success, it was just one of those things I'd never heard about Jimmy Carter that just speaks to some of his leadership skills.
Yeah, truly amazing. I hadn't heard that story. I have to look that one up. Now, I read that your motto, or one of your mottos, is make a choice, make it happen, and work every day intentionally towards whatever that goal is. Step into the sharp edges, do something that scares you, don't pull away, and don't overthink. And I was wondering, are there any strategies from your book that we can use to overcome the self-doubt that probably accompanies doing something that scares us?
I think we need to examine, what does defeat look like in life? And I think sometimes we defeat ourselves even before we get to the battlefield, because we ourselves become our biggest critic. And one of the things that I try to make people see is that every day when they look at themselves in the mirror, they're looking at the greatest human being that they will ever meet in their lifetime, because no one is as unique as the person that you see back in that mirror. But we're also the biggest critic we're ever going to see. And so the biggest mistake that we see ourselves do is we give up on ourselves in the midst of difficulty. And so the opposite of that is, what is true success in life? It means winning over the battle with ourselves. It's winning over that inner critic who tells us that we can't do the impossible things that we see in front of us. And so one of the biggest things that I encourage people to do, and it's something that I do, is we often hear of a bucket list and the importance of a bucket list. I think almost more important than the bucket list is our reverse bucket list. And so when I fear failure, or when that inner critic is speaking to me, I start writing out my reverse bucket list, which is all the accomplishments that I've made in my life that when I look back upon them, I never thought in a million years I would be able to accomplish. And once I start going through those things and what I have done, it really allows me to see the things that I'm afraid of, not as hurdles, but things that I can get over. And that's where you win life, because that's when you have won over your weaknesses.
Wow. I'll have to try to practice that myself. I've never thought about that one, reverse bucket list. I thought you were going to say it's write all the things you didn't want to do down that you actually ended up doing. That hurt you, but I like yours better. So I spend most of my life engaged in project work and doing project management. And I'm just curious, I'm going to ask a couple of project management specific questions and see if they correlate. But what are some of the principles in your book that as project managers, you think we can immediately implement to improve project work?
Well, one of the concepts that I talk about in the book is, I grew up as a servant leader. I think that was one of the biggest things that I learned in being in the military. And it worked for me for many, many years. But I think the world has changed now. And work environments, let's face it, are so diverse. We're living with fellow employees who are in multiple countries. Many of us are working from home part of the week, in the office part of the time. And when I go back and look at servant leadership, to me, it really kind of connected itself with an environment where you're face-to-face more of the time, or you are there present more with your employees. I'm not saying that you can't use it today, But in the book, I define something called a Gardner leader. And I think a Gardner leader in today's work environment is a better leadership style to invoke, because what it really means is it's intentionally nurturing your team's growth, akin to how a gardener carefully tends to each plant that's under their care. And at the core of this leadership style is this concept of being eyes on, but hands off, where the leader is informed without micromanaging, which I think is so critical in today's fast-paced, innovation-driven workplace, because it allows your team members the autonomy to experiment, to take risks, and to develop creative solutions while still having the guidance and support of their leader. And I found when I was more of a servant leader, I was more hands-on to the point that I was impacting some of that autonomy. And so there's some parts of being a Gardner leader that I think are extremely important. One I've talked about a little bit ago, which is adaptability, but you couple that with responsiveness. So a Gardner leader must adapt to the changing seasons and weather conditions that are around us, is a metaphor that I like to look at, because we are in a dynamic business landscape, and that adaptability is essential for organizations to remain competitive and responsive to market changes. They must cultivate a healthy work environment. This whole emphasis on nurturing and care extends to creating a positive and supportive work environment, which I think is the exact opposite of what's happening in so many work environments today, and why you see so many employees feeling unfulfilled by what they're doing. So this means being increasingly more focused on employee well-being, engagement, retention, and looking at individuals not just in their work environment, but what they want to accomplish more holistically in their life. It also means having a more long-term perspective. I remember being in these Fortune 50 companies where everything was based on a quarterly view of success. And the thing about gardening is it's not about immediate results, but it's about investing time and effort for long-term growth. So this leadership style really focuses on sustainable success rather than short-term gains, which I think is really important when you look at some of the long-term fixes that we need to make, whether it's climate change or some of the other things that go well beyond shareholder value. And then another really key component of this is empowerment and trust, because the Gardner leader intentionally entrusts team members with the freedom to explore and grow. And a Gardner leader builds a culture of trust and empowerment, which to me is absolutely crucial for fostering innovation and a sense of ownership, which is so important among employees.
I think that's a great point, because if you have to micromanage what they're doing, then you have to be fully engaged at all times. And to me, the best project managers are the ones that, if they didn't show up for 2 or 3 weeks, things would still progress and still, to use your analogy, they would still grow in the garden without you having to tend it every moment of every day, right? You put some basic stuff down, some nutrients, plant it well, water it, and then it's going to grow on its own if you just let it get out of its way. So I like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, because I think in my career, one of the things I saw project managers do way too much of was trying to micromanage everything that the team is doing. And I liken this to being, let's say you're General Stan McChrystal, and you're in charge of all forces in Afghanistan when he had that job. There's no way that he can micromanage what a Delta Force team is trying to do in a mountaintop in Afghanistan. He has to realize that he has trained those troops, he has given them instruction, they know their marching orders, they know the rules of engagement. He's not going to have situational awareness of what's going on. So he needs to give them enough structure to do their job, but the autonomy to do it with the skill sets that they have, and to make the judgment calls that only they can do when they're in the heat of battle. And I think the same thing even goes true to a software developer on a team. You've got to give them the latitude that they can take their creative energy to a solution and craft it in the best way that they think is going to solve the issue. while staying in the confines of the project structure that the project manager is implementing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me. I certainly agree with everything you just said. Now, on your podcast, you've interviewed some pretty influential figures, and I'm just curious, what are some of the biggest takeaways you've gotten from those interviews?
Man, I've done such...
Do you have a favorite then? I know you got so many.
Instead of picking a favorite, maybe I'll just pick a recent episode. So
okay,
I recently interviewed Ryan Holiday, and he has a new book out called Right Thing, Right Now. And it's really about the importance of doing the right thing in the moment. And we were talking about the virtue which he thinks is the most important virtue, which is justice. Out of the different Stoic virtues, there's 4 of them. And when I think about doing the right thing right now, I think about my time at the Naval Academy. And while I was there, I was selected to be on the Brigade of Midshipmen Honor Committee. And this typically is one of those softer jobs because most people aren't trying to commit honor offenses because you'd get kicked out of the institution. But my year, I was a senior. I came back from Christmas break, and we walked right into the largest cheating scandal in the institution's history. And what I saw play out was a superintendent, a 2-star admiral, who was trying to protect the reputation of the academy. And so, in so doing so, he ended up doing a number of things that were the opposite of what Ryan Holiday and I talked about in our episode. He was trying to take shortcuts and ended up doing the wrong thing at the wrong time. Because even though we realized that there were hundreds of midshipmen implicated, he tried to short circuit the whole process, make this only about 25 to 26 of them. And unfortunately, that blew up and launched a larger Navy investor IG examination to all this. It cost him his job, and it implicated somewhere around 400 midshipmen in this. And I really learned through that lesson the importance of doing the right thing, especially when no one is watching, because when you don't do the right thing and all of a sudden you have a ton of eyeballs on you, the whole thing just blows up completely out of anyone's control. So I think that whole episode with Ryan Holiday was a really transformational one.
Okay, I got a few quick hitters here. I know you have a hard stop, so let me run through them real quick. What are your future plans for Passion Struck and your career as a thought leader?
So one of the things I'm trying to double down on now is creating what I call the Passion Struck University. So I would love to be able to coach people one-on-one, but it really is too time restrictive to do the impact that I want. So I'm trying to create a university of content where currently it would reflect to the current book, Passion Struck, but in future years, I would like to write additional books like you've written and have a plethora of content in this university where people can go to it and learn how to intentionally change their lives. So that's one thing I'm working on. And I'm also right now contemplating launching a second podcast. And eventually I'd like to have a multitude of them all underneath the Passion Struck framework.
Okay. Are there any leadership principles that speak to you personally and guide your day-to-day behaviors?
I mean, there's so many. I think one of the ones that I always go back to is this whole idea of the high price of materialism that so many leaders today are faced with. There was a great book written by Tim Kasser, I think it came out in 2003, of that similar name, where our contemporary culture of consumerism and materialism affects our everyday happiness and psychological health. And I'm saying this as a leadership principle because I think when we're trying to approach so much of our life and our career based on our values centered on the accumulation of wealth or material possessions or titles etc., all it brings is a greater risk of unhappiness, anxiety, low self-esteem, and we need to be looking at what success is on completely different terms. Terms that are really intrinsic in nature, meaning the difference that we're having on other people's lives, the things that really light us up, doing things that are really igniting our inner passion and purpose more than going down what I did for many years, which was a portfolio career that brought me anything but happiness. So that would be something that I would like people to take away.
And what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Man, I've been given so many pieces of advice. I think one that I learned from Don DePani, who's used to be a Hindu priest and now used to be a Hindu monk and is now a Hindu priest. He came out with this book that was all focused on the importance of focus in our lives. And he really had this saying that life isn't short, life is finite. And I recently saw this through my sister's life, who unfortunately passed away about a month ago. But I think we sometimes view our life that whatever age we're in, it's too late to do the things that we want in life. And I just represent this life is finite because Carolyn was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. She could have given up on everything, but she had this desire that she wanted to help people, and she wanted to do so by becoming a social worker. So in the midst of undergoing all her treatments and everything else, she went back, got a master's degree, and spent the last 2 years of her life helping people through profound difficulties in their life. And she said to me in the weeks preceding her death that it was the most rewarding 2 years of her life. And I think we tend to think that we never have enough time to do the things that we want. Well, we never know when our time is going to come. So I think we need to look that life is finite, but we always have enough time, regardless of what age we're in, to take that chance on ourselves to do the things that we've always dreamed of doing.
That's a very powerful ending. I think no other question I could ask would surpass that one. So I'm sorry for your loss, but what an inspiration to take whatever time she had left and devote to others. It's amazing.
Yeah, she was an amazing woman.
So John, this has really been great. If someone wants to learn more about you, where to get the books, learn more about your podcast, how can they do that?
So if you want to learn more about me, the best place that you can do so is any of the social platforms. It's the same as my website, johnrmiles.com. And if you want to learn more about Passion Struck, you can go to passionstruck, struck.com, where you can find the book, the podcast, everything else that we're doing.
John Miles, thanks for the conversation.
Clint, thank you so much for having me. It was such an honor to be here.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.